Morris, that's what Stu's been busy with. So he was finishing off the bonnet latches last week, which he's done. He's happy with those. I'm happy with those. So that's looking good. It's basically a pair of spring-type catches that come down one each side. Very reminiscent of old series Jaguar XJs, actually. So there'll be a twin cable going to a single lever in the cabin to open that. The springs obviously pop the bonnet up when you release it, then it's just reach under one side. There's a safety catch one side for that. The actual spring and safety catch mech is basically a modified Mark 1 Golf arrangement. One side will have removed the safety, so there's only one side. But the actual latching part and all the housing for that is completely fabricated by Stu, so he's done a nice job of that. Then he moved on to the back end. So we've been umming and ahhing about this lower valance section for quite a long while. Originally it kind of curves in and then had a little downward flange with spot weld marks all the way along it. Now we'd taken out the inner layer of that, so the spot welds weren't actually spot welds anymore, it was just the marks from when they were done, and we'd had a discussion previously about should we smooth them out or should we reshape the rear valance, and we really couldn't quite decide. And then I had a discussion with the owner when he was down here, and we were talking about fog and reverse lights and how we were going to incorporate those. And we'd originally thought about having them actually hanging underneath. But then we decided it might be quite a nice way to resolve that rear valance if we refabricate it and actually incorporate them in. So we've reshaped the rear valance completely, pretty much the whole width of it slightly, and done these little slot cutouts, each of which will house a LED reverse and fog light unit. So that's looking really nice. And then with that done, Stu's moved on to some of the interior stuff. So the handbrake, that was one thing. Handbrake lever, if you probably hadn't noticed before, but that was one of the things missing from the inside. So we've used a Mark 1 Escort handbrake lever, which was just exactly what we wanted. It bolts down to a flat surface. The mounting tabs kick over to the right-hand side of the lever, which is what we wanted because we wanted the lever over to one side, so we could get some components of the interior next to it. So it was the ideal shape for us. So Stu's done the mounting for that, and then that allowed us to then move on to designing the centre console piece, which is what he's just about to start. So I sat in it earlier and had a conversation with Stu about the layout. We're clear now on how we're going to do everything there. It's going to be a fabricated steel console that runs all the way from the dash fascia there, all the way back to behind the handbrake. It'll be sculpted out around the handbrake, so the handbrake will almost sit flush with it. So it's not very intrusive, but it'll still have a good cutout to get a hand around it. Cup holders, one in front of the other next to the handbrake. Then there'll be the climate control panel and another little switch panel, which we're going to mimic the shape of the climate control panel, which will have hazard warning light, start button, fog light switch, and then potentially one more, which we could just use for another purpose, spare button, or we might just put 3 in. Then there'll be round gear gator bezel, and then in the area in front of that we're going to do a sort of recessed tray which you could put your phone in. Might do a cordless charger in there. We have done that on a couple of cars. Kaiser 1 and 2 both have cordless phone chargers. I'm just trying to think whether Utah does. Yes, it does. So we might do that. Up to the owner really on that one. It's right next to the head unit, which has a USB socket in it anyway, so you could just plug a cable into that. But that's certainly the plan. Fabricated in steel. It'll be upholstered in leather, the same as the lower section of the dash. So yeah, looking forward to Super Stu working his magic on that. And I think on that note, that's probably it for this week. We'll catch you next week for the 1 year anniversary of Retro Power Uncut. See you then.
We'll go to the back of the Morris. I can't really point directly at the various bits, so I'm going to wander around to the back of the Morris. There's a great big hoover in the way, but I'll stand over this side and talk about it, because I can't really point at the bits very easily anyway. Again, Stu's been very busy on the Morris. There's been a number of areas he's been working on. Actually, I'll flip away from Stu for a minute. One of the earlier things that was done in this latest sort of period of time we're updating on was that Richard Stubley from Autodesk, who we've mentioned before in connection with Utah, because he's done quite a bit of work for us on Utah. He's been back to visit us again, and he this time brought a structured light scanner with him instead of the Faro laser scanner. He's brought a structured light scanner, and he's done a structured light scan of the bulkhead sections, the upper bulkhead, both sides, because we're fitting 2 tanks to that bulkhead. And we thought about fabricating them. Originally, we were going to fabricate them. After a bit of toing and froing, we decided, no, actually, we're just going to do them from billet. It would make more sense to do them from billet. So he's done a scan of the bulkhead, so we've got the exact shape so that we can machine the back of the tank to match that shape. The front of the tank will be vertical, and there'll be some nice sort of artistic shape given to the tanks. On one side of the car, the tank will be a combined screen wash header, and I'll explain that in a sec, a screen wash header and a power steering reservoir. And on the, that'll be a split tank, obviously, but machined from billet, so there's no leaks between the two. And on the other side, there'll be the fluid reservoir for the hydraulic fluid, so it'll be the 2 feeds for the brake master cylinders and the single feed for the clutch master cylinder. On the split tank for the power steering and the screen wash header, the screen wash header will be a little fill tank, so you'll undo the cap, you fill the screen wash there. From the bottom of that, there'll be a port which comes through into the inside of the car, down inside the bulkhead, and that'll fill a tank that fills. There's a little, trying to look for space on this car because there is none, in the top of the footwell, above where your toes would be when you're normally seated in the car. There's actually a triangular space where the chassis tubes sweep forward and the A panel stroke inner wing come forward, and there's a pointed sort of triangular 3-dimensional pyramid shape, if you like, but a sort of 3-sided pyramid shape going into there, where we can make a screen wash tank that sits into that space, and then that's filled from the billet tank that's in the engine bay. There'll be a little breather pipe so it doesn't glug and all that. We've kind of done that. We've done that before. Long-term viewers will remember we did something similar on Gordon Murray's Escort, where we made a screen wash tank that was part of the it made a navigator's footrest for the passenger side, and that was filled via a header in the engine bay. So it's just quite a neat way of doing it. So Stu's been, sorry, that's what Richard Stubley was dealing with, the scanning, and he's going to deal with the design side of those tanks for us. We've given him a bit of an idea in terms of outline for them, so he's going to crack on with that. Stu's, the biggest piece of work, that's the biggest single piece of work to cover has been the centre console. Stu's spent a lot of time and done an absolutely beautiful, stunning job of the centre console for the Morris. It's all formed in sheet steel. It has several cutouts, and it has a large cutout at the front, which is for a mobile phone charging station, sort of a recess where you can just drop your phone onto the what do you call it? The non-plug-in, the contactless charging point. Then behind that, there's an oval cutout, which is the place where the controls for the vintage air unit will be located. And then behind that, there are 4 holes, which are for various switches, which I can't remember all of. I know there's the hazard switch. Is there a starter switch? I can't actually remember. Carol will know all that. There's no point me even attempting to remember what all the switches are for. Fog light switch, possibly another one. But there are 4 cutouts behind that for 4 additional switches. And then there's obviously a niche in the side, which I think we mentioned before, because we finalised where we were going to put the handbrake. There's a niche in the side so that the handbrake's recessed into that tunnel top. And it does look extremely neat. Stu's done a really nice job of that, because it's quite a challenging piece to fabricate. And that's all come together extremely nicely. So Stu's done that. He's also then done some work, which I've seen him doing today, on the side repeaters. The specific request that side repeaters are wanted on this car, and it's a good idea to have them anyway, but we don't want to break up the sides of the car too much. So where the original bonnet mouldings go down the sides of the bonnet, there's an aluminium, I think it might actually be cast Mazak or something. There's a non-ferrous cast trim strip that goes down both sides of the bonnet originally. We're reusing that trim strip, but Stu's machined a hole in that, made some recesses that some spot welded on sheet steel recesses that are spot welded into the bonnet, and then the side repeaters mount into those and just protrude just proud of that original trim strip on the bonnet, and and they're very, very bright, but only quite small units, so they're very neat and you don't really notice them. So that's a very neat setup. And I'm trying to refresh my memory. I'm going to wander around the front because I'm trying to refresh my memory on the other bits that we've covered all the bonnet latching. Stu's that was all covered on previous episodes. Another thing that's relevant on this, but not to what Stu was working on, is that we've also had the engine has been dynoed. Richard at Omex has finished the build on that, had it on the dyno. I think it made 207 horsepower off the top of my head on the dyno, so it's a nice 2 litre Z-Tech, relatively straightforward spec, so it's nice road drivable. We're not going for mega power, it just needs to be nice and torquey. That's been on the dyno, that's all good. So he's going to be dropping that off, I believe, next week. So that'll be another little tick in a box for things we need for the car. Other areas then, flitting back to Stu and metalwork, Stu has sorted out the electric window lifts. The customer wanted electric window lifts on the car. We've been fighting a little bit with space in the doors and trying to work out a mechanism that will operate within quite a tight space that's of a reasonable quality level that looks like it'll actually last for a while and that we're confident in working. And interestingly, similarly to the door locks, the solution that Stu's come up with really was to use another mini part, but it's not an actually original mini part. There's an electric window conversion kit available for minis that's actually reasonably well made, that uses a motor with a remote cable set up so that the motor can be remote to the actuator for the glass. And obviously the mini glass is similar dimensionally to the Morris Minor glass. It's flat. The up and down travel is very similar, so we speculated that would probably be feasible. Stu's got them fitted, it is feasible, it all works, that was really good. So yeah, happy with that. And the other bit that Stu's done is the kick panel trims, the footwell trims, if you like. They're actually in aluminium. They're retained by there are speakers in the kick panels, in the footwell, in the sides of the footwells, and the speaker retaining bolt screws also retain these panels, and the panels then space off to allow the room for the speaker, and also within that spacing they also allow room on one side of the car for the battery cable, and on the other side of the car for the main front to rear wiring loom to run through, because that wiring runs in protection and through grommets, etc. obviously runs through the sill sections. Obviously on the Morris Minor the sill's actually reasonably accessible inside because it's got the punched holes along both sides within the door shut, with a cover plate over it. So we're running again, due to a lack of space, there's literally not really room to run it anywhere else. We're running those down inside those trim panels that Stu's made, through an access hole into the sill, through the sill, and then back out of an access hole in the rear of the car. And it's just a neat way to hide that wiring loom and the battery feed cable out of the way where they can't get damaged, and they can be protected with some nice conduit. So that's where that's going, and Stu's done the panels for that. And I think that pretty much covers where we're at on Morris. We'll wander along to the Morris Minor, where I can't really find a very good place to stop, so I'm going to hide round here behind a gas bottle and really annoy Jamie. I don't know if I can shut the bonnet on this actually, possibly. There we go, I can shut the bonnet enough that I can talk over it. There we go, that'll do. You may have noticed before I shut the bonnet, there's no engine in there anymore. That's because Stu's been busy dismantling it. As you'll notice, there's quite a lot missing. He's pulled the front subframe out, which is a standard Mazda MX-5 front subframe. He's pulled the front panel, the radiator, the front lower piece that bolts into these tubes here out. He's pulled the engine and gearbox out on the front subframe, and I think he's pulled the rear. Yes, he's pulled the rear subframe out as well. Don't know where it's gone. Somewhere. He's pulled the rear subframe out as well, so that he can then make the rotisserie connections for this, which he's working on at the minute, there being a piece of. He'll be carrying on, there's bits around me somewhere, so he'll have the bits around. He's going to be making the rotisserie mount so we can finish fully stripping all the bits off this car, take the wings off and a few other bits, put it on the rotisserie, spin it round, and do all the welding work underneath that we couldn't do while it was on the jig. If you remember, going back quite a while now, it was on the Select jig when I built the entire chassis, which would have been around this time last year, built all the chassis on the jig. There's lots of bits of tube work underneath I couldn't get round to weld, So Stu's going to then get this on the rotisserie and finish all the TIG welding work on all the sections underneath that were inaccessible previously, and do various other work. There's a number of other jobs as well. It's not just weld finishing. There's a number of other jobs that need doing from the underside on this car. A lot of plumbing provisions. He's been putting threaded bosses in to mount because at this stage, while it's in bare metal, we put all provisions in for mounting all the fuel lines, brake lines. You'll have heard us talk about this before. Carol will have talked about it as well. But we put all the provisions in for mounting all the fluid lines. So he's been welding the bosses in, or at least tap welding the bosses in underneath, and making the brackets that will then bolt to those bosses to carry quite a lot of lines, because we've got a remote servo in the back on this. So the brake lines are all doubled up. We've got a long vacuum line to run to that. We've got the 2 fuel lines. There's a lot of pipe work to run around the car and not much space. So again, the bracket work's been done extremely neatly underneath to get the pipes to all miss the Mazda PPF that has to still run the power plant frame, as they call it, the big aluminium piece that joins that basically mounts the front end of the diff and the rear end of the gearbox and ties the two together. Because the entire powertrain in a Mazda, if you don't realise, is mounted on 4 mounts. There are 2 diff mounts, 2 engine mounts, and that carries the entire powertrain. There's no rear gearbox mount and there's no diff nose mount. The torque reaction from the nose of the diff in a Mazda MX-5 is reacted to the tail of the gearbox and vice versa. It's a very good way of doing it. Gives you a very direct feel to the driving experience. But anyway, again, gone off on a tangent. He's been routing all the fluid lines to miss that PPF, which is actually quite difficult because it's very tight, and we've got an exhaust under there as well and lots of things to get in the way. So it's fortunate that Stu's not got much hair, so he can't really tear it out, so he'll be all right. He's getting on okay with it. So that's where we're at with Morris. So you'll probably see this, well, you will see this upside down next week, which will be quite nice because you'll be able to see all of the engineering in the underside of it, because there's not a lot of Morris there. You'll be able to see all of that laid bare from underneath next week, so that'll be good. Moving onwards, we'll move over to the Morris, which has shuffled around the workshop a bit. So the bits of footage of this will show it in various locations. It's actually moved between those locations fairly quickly. This isn't video that's been shot over a long period of time. It's just that the car's moved a lot because there's chaos going on over there, which we'll see in a minute. On this, Stu's actually going to go through a couple of things. First of all, though, I'll say Stu had the car on the rotisserie over there in front of our paint booth to finish the bulk. I think there's still 1 or 2 bits, but basically finish the bulk of the underside welding on the car, mainly finishing the TIG welds on the main chassis tubes that couldn't be done when it was on the jig, which I've talked about before, so I won't go on about, but he's finished all those TIG welds underneath the chassis. He's welded on a number of bosses underneath for mounting various things for various pipe routings. He'd done some of them on a previous video, but he's now finished all of the bosses that needed welding on underneath. I think there may be 1 or 2 still tiny little bits of finishing off, but he's basically finished all the significant welding tasks underneath the car now. And then there were 2 quite tricky detail tasks to cover. The first one of which is the front panel area. These little mounts here, which hold the front panel to the wing support rail. And I'll hand over to Stu actually and let him tell you about that, because we've got Jamie's got a bit of footage of Stu telling it direct from the horse's mouth. So over to Stu.
Yeah, this is the original end of the wing support panel, which we've got to remake because due to the modifications on the front, we eliminated the original wing mounting point, which was about here. So what I'm trying to do is recreate a new end to the panel with a bolt hole captive nut in there, so that will recreate the original mounting point, so we can actually bolt the wing back in its original place.
And the second area that also Stu will tell you about is in the door shuts. We had a bit of an issue. The Morris doors were never really designed to have wiring fed into them because they didn't need wiring fed into them originally. Now we do need to put wiring into them because we've now fitted electric windows, and that's quite challenging with the standard A-pillars. But to explain all that, I'll again hand over to Stu because he'll tell you about all that and how he's solved that problem. So over to Stu again.
Now basically, to get the wiring to go from the pillar through to the door, the gap between the pillar and the door is so close that we're going to have to recess that section there so we can get the fitting in for the wiring. So that's what these are for. I've got to make a boss up, a threaded boss for the back, weld that in and then sink those into the pillar. Then we can put the fitting in. So then we'll take the tube for the wiring to go through to the door.
Right, and that pretty much caps off where we're at on the Morris this week. Stu's working on the rear end today. Stu's again been off for a couple of days. He's back today for a bit, but then he's actually away again next week. He's working on the rear end at the moment, finalising the drawings for the fuel tank. We've got a CAD model for the fuel tank. But he's going to just do the final tweaks on that drawing just to make sure that we know where everything fits and that there's no bits I've missed, because it's quite possible that drawing was done a long time ago, so it's quite possible something else has happened and fouled up what was going to fit where. So he's going to check that. He's going to work out the spare wheel mounting, because it's going to have a space saver spare wheel in it, an MX5 space saver spare wheel. So we need to work out the mounting for that, and again make sure that we've got room for that and the fuel tank together. We've done that, but we need to just verify it for the final time before we commit to actually getting the fuel tank made. Because that'll be fabricated by Concept Racing in aluminium. And he's also doing bracketing in the boot for trim panels and for wiring and those sort of things as well. So that's the next stages on this.
Let's have a look at the Morris. So we'll start with the bonnet. We had previously done some reinforcement across here and designed a latching method here, because the bonnet, as you know now, flips forward rather than up from the front. But we weren't happy that it all latched, but there was a lot of flex in the bonnet still, and if you weren't particularly careful when you were shutting it, it was very easy to get it slightly out of line and the latch pins not go into their holes, or it just didn't quite feel right, basically. It felt like you had to be quite careful to put it down and then shove it in certain ways to get it to go into its latches. And I really want it so you can pretty much just shove it down and not have to worry about anything like that. So Stu's been reworking all of this rear edge here, which I think he's done a little piece about himself, so I'll hand over to Stu for a second on that.
What I'm doing here is making a new reinforcer for the rear edge of the bonnet. The reinforcer that we had before was a little bit too flexible. And the bonnet itself is pretty weak as far as structure goes. So I had to make this new reinforcer which will incorporate the repeater lights which sit through the outer trims. And I'm just at the moment making up the catch plates which will hold the bonnet catches themselves to fit there. So this is what I'm just doing at the moment, just trying to make this box up, which will incorporate the captive nuts to hold the catch, and then get all that welded in. I'll tap the edge over this end, bond the front edge, and then spot weld behind where the trim will fit. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, so that seems to be going quite well. Looking forward to Stu kind of getting through this and trial fitting that back on the car, and hopefully we've made a big improvement, because I think this will have really stiffened up the bonnet. I don't know if Stu mentioned, but one of the big issues really is that it's just a single skin here, which you almost never see on a car where a panel is just a single skin. It normally has an edge that's rolled round over an inner reinforcer. And just a single skin on that there is not really acceptable. To be honest, it wasn't really an acceptable method of construction originally, but that seemed to be the way quite a lot on these cars. Although everybody gets upset when I suggest that they weren't perfectly engineered originally. So what else has Stu been on this? He was doing the interior light mount. So we wanted a centrally mounted interior light sort of up in the front of the roof area of a reasonable size. So we're using just a generic Heller interior light, and Stu's made a little metal pod that bolts up into that reinforcer. I think he's rib nutted the reinforcer, and then the pod, we've done slots in it so it's adjustable in its exact position. We've also left it over length, because what we want to do is, because it's going to meet up with the headlining, the top edge of it, I want to make sure that it meets perfectly with the headlining. So we're going to leave the final fettling of that piece until we've upholstered the interior, so we can then trim the edge of that pod to meet up perfectly with the headlining all the way around. So we've taken that as far as we will now until the rest of the car's built. I talked about previously, but I don't think we saw it done, was the speedo aperture. So these cars originally have a fairly large speedometer aperture in the middle of the dash, and we wanted to retain that piece of design. Now there's a company that we've used quite a few times. They're in the States, called Classic Instruments. They make some really amazing instruments, and they do one that I think it's something like 5.5 or 5 3/4 inch diameter, and it's got a speedo on there, it's got a tacho, it's got temperature, oil pressure, volts and fuel level, and it's a really nice classic looking design. So I wanted to use one of those. It's just something like 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch, possibly bigger than the original. But we figured it would be much better much less time consuming to refabricate the dash than to actually have a completely bespoke instrument made, which they will do. You know, they've made bespoke gauges for us before, but it makes more sense just to use their off-the-shelf one. And so Stu's fabricated a little enlarged aperture that basically has been welded into the dash to make that whole pod sort of hole bigger, but still integrate with the shape that was already there. So that's looking neat. And another thing we've been on this, George has been doing the mirror mounts. So you saw previously that Stu was tasked with the job of creating single piece glass. So he's redone the frame so that the quarter light frame is much further forward, just leaves a little triangle in the front corner of the door. We're going to have custom glass made for it, which is then obviously much larger. We've done all the mechanisms for electric lowering and raising on that, so that's all in place. And then we were looking at mounting the mirror on that little corner piece that results at the front. And when Stu did the frames, he made just a little sheet metal piece to go in there to represent what will finally be in there. But the plan was always to make a machined piece to go in there. And what we've done is we've used an off-the-shelf mirror that comes with a mounting base, but removed that mounting base and then designed those little corner pieces to have that mounting part actually integrated into the shape. So that will be machined as a single unit from billet. Probably be black anodized aluminium, I imagine, in the final fitment. And that not only infills that gap, mounts the window frame, mounts the frame to the door, but also integrates the shape that then mounts the wing mirror on the outside. So that's I thought was quite a cool little feature. So that's about where we're at on this. I think Stu's just going to plough through that reinforcement, tweaking on the bonnet, getting the lashes perfected on that. And then actually we are extremely close to being done metalwork wise. You saw last week, of course, he had it rolled upside down to do all the underside finish welding, which is all done. Basically everything inside's done. I think we've got a few little details left to do in the boot. We want to do some anchor points in there for a spare wheel. Possibly going to mount a small active subwoofer in there. And we need to make the mounting provision for the trim panels in the boot. But with that done and the bonnet done, and there's a little bit of lead loading to do on some of the body shut lines, I think that's basically it metalwork wise. So I would say, sticking my neck out here, I reckon 3 weeks, given that Stu's away for some period next week, I'd say 3 weeks and this will be metalwork done. And I'll probably pretty much leave it there. We've been working on the Camaro, but there's a bit of sort of trauma over there with the paint booth build. The new paint booth build isn't going overly smoothly, down to the company that are doing it. So we actually have the Camaro stuck in an area that we can't get it out of until the new paint booth's finished, and thus we can knock down the old one. So we're getting quite close on that, to the point where we need to get primer on it, and at the moment we can't do that. So we'll see where we're at next week on the paint booth. I'm hoping we'll get a really solid week from the guys who are installing that this coming week, and we'll make progress there. But yeah, we'll leave it at that, and see you again next time.